Mrs. Redwine. Like I said, I'm Halima Ismail. I work for Grand Rapids Public Schools. Previous, I was a teacher. So you'll hear me refer to English language learner. And because you are going to be future educators in our county and, like I said, the state or around the nation, because I know jobs are scarce at the moment, budget cuts are not looking good. I hear from the State Department for the next 5 years. I don't want you to give hope, because this population has still continued to move into our schools. 2 weeks ago, I helped to enroll a student from, was it California or Texas? I forget now, but you know, has just come from another school district in the state, but has what we call standard English language qualities. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Spanish speaker in his home. Now I have a student, this is a tough one, back and forth from Guatemala, but was recently in California for a short amount of time, and it just keeps on coming all through the year. So I would encourage you, if you were a friend of mine, say study up on the English language learner. If there are courses, seminars like this one that you can continue to do within a school or on your own, the more you know, the more powerful your information will not only help you as teachers in terms of informing your instruction, in terms of the way you teach. It will help you meet the needs of the English language learner in the classroom, but you will be able to talk about the information you learned and sell yourself based on the information you learned, which will make you appealing to me if I'm sitting on your hiring committee. So there's two reasons why I really want you to learn about what I'm about to talk to you about. Was one, because you're going to have these English language learners in your class, and if I'm on your data review committee and you're giving me data about how the students are learning in your class, you need to know how they learn, and you need to know the challenges. The second reason is, to get a job today, you have to be able to speak to the needs of English language learner. Really, truly, to be honest, we're pushing at the state level to have you be more trained in linguistics, second language learner, the process of learning that, how to learn a second language. So, without further ado here, did you know 57% of limited English proficient adolescents nationwide are US born? Up to 27% are members of the second generation, and I found that very common at Stocking Elementary. At the time that I started, there were 4 second grade classrooms. I always got the students that were the lowest, the ones that came straight from Mexico, the ones that came straight from China. And we did get some students from China and other countries as well. Not as high as the Hispanic population from Mexico, but it happened. And Somalia. So I would have that class, but I would look next door to my neighbor, Mr. Schaub, and he was teaching a class of second generation Hispanics. Some of the parents that didn't graduate, some that did and were working full time, but he was getting students that were representing kids that were born here. You know, born and bred, Grand Rapids is what we called them. Born at Spectrum Health or St. Mary's, and started off in our preschool kindergarten and continued all our way. So you're going to run into both of those groups big time as you become educators and you have your first couple of years as classroom teachers and throughout your career. 30% are third generation. While educated in the US, they still do not speak English adequately. And I mentioned that they're going to be referred to in literature, in my presentation, and throughout your readings as ELLs. They can be SLs, cells, we've been calling them in my book club, made up of teachers. They're standard English language learners, and they avoid writing in English. The other terms I'm going to use today are LTELs or LFS. But when we talk about cells specifically, these are students that have been here. Their writing is below grade level. These are all generalizations, but when we look at data across the district and across our state and across the country, this is what are the common themes. They have a background specific to US culture and history. These learners speak non-standard English, Ebonics, Tex-Mex, and usually have no background for references to the US culture and or history. Okay, so this can also include our African American population, because at home they may be speaking a non-standard form of English. When I was taking classes for TESOL, that's teaching English as a second language at Grand Valley State University, those professors refer to as Ebonics or non-standard English as a dialect. So you will find linguists that refer to that as a non-standard form of English, and those children come to our classrooms that way. Excuse me, bringing in that language or that dialect into our classrooms. So you're going to run into kids that know about Selena, Jennifer Lopez, and they just may not know about, you know, the reason why we have 4th of July. When you read about English language learner literature, English language learners, most of the research comes from Cummins, and he talks very specifically about the BICS and the CALP. The BICS are the basic interpersonal communicative skills. So when I come from Mexico, 2nd grade or at 10th grade, the first thing I'm going to get are my BICS. I like to refer to them as the recess words. Go, teacher, I play outside, ball. They begin to have those expressions for the everyday words. The CALP are the cognitive academic language proficiencies. That's the academic language that they need to have to read that biology textbook, to understand and apply the terms of the biology textbook. And this is our challenge overall in Grand Rapids Public Schools, even Caledonia Public Schools. If we have students that, no matter their background, come in with academic vocabulary or lack of English because they've been using a non-standard form, because their lifestyle hasn't always been attuned to education, they will struggle with cognitive academic language proficiency. Struggling readers, no matter their race, their culture, their background, struggle, usually with biology text. So I want you to understand, and if you work in the English language learner field, you'll find that the practices that we use, the strategies we use are good for all kids, especially struggling readers. But what's very common in the world you'll be working in with students and teachers is that teachers will say, or secretary will say, I'm not sure that student needs to have extra support. A secretary will say that because he's been speaking to me in English. And what she means is, do you need a hamburger? Or do you need, I shouldn't say hamburger, but do you know, the school nurse or the secretary may ask him a question like, what's your name? And tell me something about you. And they've learned through their brothers or sisters, through being in the country for a short amount of time, and you know, in some cases it's even a year and a half too, that to say, you know, my favorite color is red, or I like soccer. Because we can pick that from TV, we can pick that from our friends, we can pick them from siblings. But that doesn't mean they have cognitive academic language proficiency. But I was trying to make a reference to secretaries because in a lot of our schools, especially the ones where they're just getting an emergent population, that's what you'll hear. Oh, they walked in the door and mom answered a few questions, so they speak English. They won't need English language learner support. But until we give them the ALPA, which I didn't do a slide for, but if you want to write it down, ELPA. You can Google it or search it under the state of Michigan. If you go to state of Michigan Department of Education and go to the search on the right-hand corner and put in ELPA, that is the English language proficiency assessment that has to be given to any student who speaks another language in their home. So, like I mentioned, the secretary, they're usually the front people that meet our students. And I, in my position that I'm in now, and even as a teacher, had to explain the difference between BICS and CALP. We don't really know what they know until we give them the ALPA. Because if you and I decide to go to China, you're going to pick up pretty quickly how to say yes, no, thank you, can I have fries with that? You know, we learn ways very quickly to get by. And that's where kids trick us. And that's why we have to be very careful in placing students and giving them the appropriate services. So the state of Michigan decided to use the ALPA. You know, as teachers, we all have our issues with the ALPA and having to give the ALPA, but it's grade level based test and it's academic based. So if I have a new student walk into my building, or you as future teachers, you would probably be notified if they check off that box on the registration form that says speaks another language, and you would be administrating the ALPA. If it's not ALPA season, because like the MEEP, there's a time for the real ALPA, the full-blown ALPA. If it's not that time of the year and if it's just September 9, the second day of school, you'll give them the ALPA screener, which is just a smaller version of the real test. So everybody here is familiar with the MEEP or the MME. that schools give it, or you went through that when you were in school. So if you had a friend that was from South Korea or from Mexico, in the last couple of years, they had to take the ALPA. And if you walk in, if you never had it in the spring, you would be given the ALPA screener. That gives us information on how academically they score based on their grade level in English in the areas of writing, reading, speaking, and listening. 3 of the 4 components you can do in a group assessment, but the speaking section you must do one-on-one. But it's the first test that I'm aware of, even for special education, where it's a very specific test one-on-one on speaking. So the state even knows the importance of a child being able to communicate. And the questions are not, what's your favorite color? They're academically driven. So they use pictures in the lower L to explain a concept. Are there any questions? I went pretty fast over that ALPA piece, and I hope I gave you enough information about the BICS and the CALP.
Do you know if that's similar to what they use here on the college campus for the English language learners?
I don't think that the college campus has to use the ALPA because that's a state. The state, yeah. I have a feeling that community college has something similar, and because they're a state institution, they probably use something similar that the state wants them to use for adult learners, but for K-12, that's a state mandate. So if you move to Ann Arbor, you'll be giving the ALPA. If you're here in Kent County, you'll be giving the ALPA. Or using the data to decide who's going to be placed where. Because that's the next step, is how to use the data. So I talked to you about the first group. Now this is the second group. All of these terms come from a book, Freeman and Freeman. Another thing you want to Google, the Freeman, a husband and wife team, have written many books on struggling readers, the connection between the two, struggling readers and limited English proficiency students, or ELLs. So ELLS are our long-term English language learners. They often speak non-standard dialect of English. They avoid writing in English and reading, and it's below grade level. And they usually have some background reference specific to the US and history. So they may have some more information geography-wise or facts about the United States. Limited formal schooling of ELLs, or LFS, speak little or no English, usually unable to write more than labels or short sentences. They have none. Really, they have no background information. It says little, but really, they come with no background knowledge at assumed for grade level, and they lack background knowledge of US culture. So the student from Guatemala, she was in our program. She was in a program in California for a few years, but I would still consider a newcomer because now she's coming back from Guatemala after many years in Guatemala and not having a formal education setting every year in Guatemala. It was sporadic, and it turns out that her mother died over there, so there was probably a lot going on in her background or her everyday life in Guatemala. She's LFS. She's coming back to us, and she never was in Grand Rapids. She was in California for a short while in elementary school, went back to Guatemala, stayed there, and now returned. And then it's a hard time to return to the United States, but she's 17. And our job becomes to catch her up. We want her to graduate, and we want her to learn to read and write so that she can get the skills she needs to succeed in this world. So when you think of a newcomer, think LFS, the person that has come straight from the country. Even though she's come back and forth, she still, for this definition, would be an LFS. Now, a couple of years ago, I want to say about 20 years ago, researchers, linguists got together and they said, you know, we have to agree upon strategies to use for English language learners. We have to come up with a protocol, basically. There was a big bilingual education trend. And then what cycled through the country was a new educational trend, and that was the English as an approach to teaching learners. Because in California, where a lot of this started, there was Burmese students, Chinese students, Japanese students, Mexican students that were coming from different countries, and the demand of all the different languages doesn't allow for you to speak in English and Spanish. It worked in Grand Rapids to a certain extent, but what we found and what research has found is that we can teach in English. We may have to rely on the native language, especially with secondary students, because if they come with literacy skills, we can build off of that. But there's been a cycle, a change in philosophy to a large extent. Doesn't mean that bilingual education doesn't exist, Doesn't mean that doesn't have a place in our education system, but what has happened is an ESL model. A big part of that ESL model, or sheltered instruction, is SIOP. I don't think you'll go through a master level program anymore, or even an undergrad program, because I hear Michigan State is offering a minor in teaching English as a second language. Well, as when I went there, they didn't have that as a minor. What I'm getting at is take graduate level classes on getting a degree called teaching English as a second language, or if you go to Michigan State, like I said, and try to minor in it, you'll hear about SIOP. You'll probably hear about SIOP before that if you just begin to do some research on it. It's an instrument originally used by researchers to measure teacher implementation of sheltered instruction, and that protocol is now used all over the district for GRPS, all over the county. It's big right now, and it's been big for the last 5 years. I think because of Kent County's numbers, though, the incoming move of refugees and just different groups of students, there's been an additional focus at the Kent ISD level. Casey Gordon has made sure that there's quite a few trainings in the past 2 years that I've noticed on SIOP. Grand Rapids Public Schools, to give you another example of what my district has done, has trained approximately 100 teachers and about 25 administrators on this model. But you will hear about it throughout your career. And here's some research as to why it impacts students. So it stands for Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. And sheltered instruction is really just scaffolding text, scaffolding the information you want to present, differentiating. Those keywords that you probably hear about in education programs. It's making sure the content that you teach is accessible to all. So if I'm visually impaired, I'm doing SIOP. But researchers, you know, they had a research project. They came up with something to meet the needs of English language learners, and it was the first time that linguists got together to do this. And teacher professionals, I shouldn't just say linguists. So they came up with this protocol. But what I'm getting at, what I want you to leave when you leave this presentation, is understanding that it's best practice. It's good, solid teaching, and it can impact any classroom of learners that you have. Because you're also going to find that there's a growing trend or a large number of English language learners that become special ed. And that's got to change, because I think a lot of them were in special ed just because we didn't know how to service them properly. So you'll hear me talk about RTI in a few minutes, and you'll know that SIOP will impact all learners, but because we're talking specifically about ELLs, it will work for them. Questions? Go ahead. In the red?
I just wondered, the test you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. The ALPA.
Yeah, you said it's for the state of Michigan. Are there other states that use that as well?
That's a good question. The states have gotten together and created standards. So you've heard of GLICkies, right? Grade level expectations, content expectations, or GLICs. Some school districts or people refer to them as GLICs. I always call them GLICkies. Grade level content expectations. The state of Michigan, along with creating an assessment to use to figure out placement of English language learner, has come up with English language proficiency standards. Other states, there's a consortium of at least 12 to 15 states, and I believe it's called WIDA, that have combined or agreed upon standards. Unfortunately, Michigan didn't take that vote, didn't take that step, and we're not in that consortium. So they, I would assume, probably are using the same language proficiency test. But I know between 17 and 19 states joined a consortium effort to say, you know what, we're going to have the same English language learner proficiency standards. So we're going to say for the lowest level of learners, this is what you need to know. And you can find our standards on that same page that I referred to, State of Michigan Department of Ed. If you go to the search button and put ELPA, E-L-P-A, you can also do another search and put in English language proficiency standards. And what you're going to get are proficiency standards for Michigan, and I refer to them as the GLICs for English language learners. So if you have a basic student, which we call the newcomer or the lowest level that you can have, we refer to them in GRPS as basic level, you're going to use standards that the state developed at the basic level. You'll look at L1, level 1. What should you be working on in terms of standards? So I gave you a really long answer, but what I'm getting at is that there are states that have become organized and said, you know what, we need to have the same standard. The same way right now I've been hearing that there's a push for national standards.
That's what would make
But
sense.
But what we haven't joined that group. Michigan hasn't. Michigan probably wants to write their own assessment and have control of it. At this point, I haven't heard us joining the WIDA, but there is a large group, and you should know this because you may be teaching out of state, of states that have decided to have the same standards in terms of English language proficiency, and I would think that they probably use the same assessment. Because if you have the same standards, you're probably testing them the same. So in terms of SIOP, sheltered instruction, observation protocol, that's the second piece. They came up with sheltered instruction components, and then the observation protocol is really just a checklist, a protocol that guides you to know what to look for. Because here we were, all these bilingual ed certified teachers, because remember I told you that was the move that the country went through even earlier than 20 years. And then there was a push for ESL. So linguists got together, and I said teacher professionals, and created a protocol, what look-fors, basically criteria that makes a room or a teacher using sheltered instruction. So that's where the OP comes from, observation protocol. This is a model self-assessment that I give our teachers in our district. I don't ask for it back. I say after you've been trained, start asking yourself what you do daily, what you do occasionally, what you do never. And then what we talk about after a lesson is a very reflective conversation as to what their strengths and weaknesses are, what they want to work on next. Those are the first 3 components of SIOP. There's 8 core components. The first one is what you guys are going to be learning about in your teacher preparation courses, and it's just the preparation. It's the use, very specifically for language learners though, of a content and language objective, meaningful activities. I'll get into that a little bit more if there's time, but building background includes emphasizing key vocabulary and linking the past learning to new concepts. Comprehensible input, clear expectations is a big piece of that. Use of appropriate speech, and the use of a variety of teaching techniques. So in my short presentation right now, I've probably taken not enough time to give you wait time. I haven't engaged you enough, which are strategies of SIOP, but I've also talked too fast in many pieces of it. And that's because I'm watching the clock, but also because it's a problem that I have. So I want you to be aware of the fact, though, because of SIOP, though, I'm more conscientious of it. And I'm definitely trying to work on the engagement piece, because I know just as students that will be in your classrooms, it's very easy to lose sight of what I want you to learn if I'm just standing at the podium. If I'm not creating meaningful activities where you stop and turn to your partner and talk, and then I call on 2 groups to share each other's learning. Or unless I take the time to learn your names and then engage you with a meaningful activity, right? Because how do you learn the best? That was a question you can answer. Hands-on learning, a project-based approach, right? Thematically. If I gave you a list of vocabulary words like I sort of did with that BICS and CALP and SELs, until we engage in conversation about it, not only will I not know what you know, but you won't leave here really learning the terms until you engage in writing a paper about it, and even in a short amount of time that I have with you, even engaging in conversation. Because you're going to remember those terms better if we talk about them. Am I right? So what do you remember about SLs? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. But you prove my point, right? The standard language English learner. It gives me a chance to go back and reteach, which is another point of SIOP. No, I want to go to previous, and I don't know why. ELLS are the ones that often speak non-standard dialect of English. We talked about long term, but I needed to go back to the other one. Just give me a minute here. The CELLS are standard English language learners. These are our students that like to speak Ebonics, Tex-Mex, Spanglish. Okay, so as a teacher, I have to be cognizant of that. I have to stop. I have to ask questions. I have to have them turn to their neighbor and talk, share out, because if I don't take time to engage what my students are supposed to be learning, and all I do in my U.S. history class is create a PowerPoint where you write notes and take a test at the end of the week, not only am I not going to have a sense of where they are in their learning, but it's boring, and you're not going to learn it. You're not going to care about it. And at the end of the day, at the end of the week, when you have to regurgitate it on a test, what are you really meaningfully going to remember, right? Very little. So I want you to be cognizant of that, as I am trying to be today. SIOP stresses and has teachers spend a lot of time talking about using different techniques. Spot checking, taking time to put students in a group of 4 and have one student take the term ELLS. You put it in a sentence. The second student can write a picture about it. The third student can ask a question about it in 4-square model. Okay, the fourth student could do something else with it. Those are just examples of things that I could do had we not been in a podium setting or in an auditorium setting, had I have more time, and to make sure that you're learning something from this. Any questions? So SIOP, somebody tell me something you remember about SIOP, please.
Can you explain in a nutshell what it is?
Yes, so it's a protocol, it's a checklist, but think of 8 components of SIOP. If you have this document here, it'll help you visually see it. The SIOP people were made up of linguists and teacher professionals that said, you know what, the nation needs to come up with specific components that is good teaching, but it's also sheltered instruction. Sheltered instruction is when you meet the needs of all learners. It's making sure that the information is accessible to all learners. That's the right word. Sheltered instruction, which you'll be engaging in classrooms. You may be the teacher that they list in the scheduling is biology for ELLS, or biology sheltered instruction in quotation, in parentheses. So that means that your particular class will have English language learners, and you'll be taking that biology text and you'll be breaking it up into small passages by scaffolding it, read and retell. Let's stop and have a discussion based on my 4 PowerPoint slides. So I'm going to pose a question. I'm going to have you write in your notebook what you think is the answer, and then turn to your neighbor, share each other's papers, and then report back to me. I'll pick on 4 different groups to share back. So what I'm getting at is, in the world of English language learners throughout the country, there was a need to come up with a protocol, a list of practices. The good news is that if you read this, it's what you should be doing as good teachers, as effective teachers. It's what every teacher should be doing. So special education folks and ELL folks get along really well because our strategies are exactly the same. And because you'll have struggling readers in your biology class, in your regular text, in your regular class, you'll probably visit the ESL teacher and say, you know what, I have these students that can't read very well, the 9th grade biology or the 10th grade biology text. How are you breaking down the text? Because you've been specifically trained, or because you have taken it upon yourself because you're ambitious to learn how to scaffold text better, you'll find results among all students. Because I know when I was in college and even in high school, I had to reread the text more than once, and I grew up here. So my point is, in a nutshell, I have a problem with that nutshell piece. SIOP is sheltered instruction. Sheltered instruction is making, lots of times I say text, but instruction accessible. They broke it down into 8 components. That's the bullet statement. It's a long one, but that's the best way you can explain SIOP. It's an instrument, it's a protocol, and you'll be using it to reflect on your teaching, as will your administrators. If you walk into a building where they say we're using SIOP as a specific teaching instruction tool, please note, or please remember that your evaluator, your administrator, will be looking for these qualities, these components of instruction. And if you work in Kent County, like I say, many, many, many schools have used this training that's now being given by Pearson, a textbook company, and by others. But they're using this model, I should say, of SIOP. Those are the first 3 core components. Here are the next 3. We talked a lot about strategies already, and it's a core component of SIOP. Did I use a read and retell procedure for taking 2 pages of the biology text that I know are going to be on the test? Did I take time to teach students the read and retell procedure, even though I'm a science teacher? Did my students use it successfully? How do I know that? Well, it's because I've collected their journals, or because I gave them a note card and I asked them to write down a specific sentence that they think is important. You can even start with a key paragraph, and they can just write down which paragraph it is, a key sentence, and then a key word. And when you collect those at the end of your class, you'll have a sense of, do they really know what's important on those 2 pages? And if not, you may have to go back and refocus them the next day. So there's a bunch of strategies that you'll be learning about in your teacher ed programs that will work to promote higher order thinking skills, and that's what SIOP has as a core component. The interaction that I've talked quite a bit about, the frequent opportunities for discussion, that's key. And it's key, as you guys know, from being college students, on how you learn. Because if I'm the only one talking and we're supposed to be reading Shakespeare, you know, how do you really understand the theme of it? How much can you really get if I'm just giving you PowerPoint after PowerPoint, or presentation after presentation, lecture after lecture, unless you engage with your peers, the students in the class, and ask questions? You got it. You heard me mention differentiation, which is the hot word in education today, but it's exactly what you said. SIOP is trying sheltered instruction. The first 2 letters of SIOP represent sheltered instruction, and that's making your instruction accessible to all learners. And we talked about in the context of special education. A special education teacher, in a lot of settings now, the secondary level, is doing co-teaching. So I am maybe speaking, but they may be writing on chart paper some key words. They may be working with a small group in the same room. And so you've made a really good connection. Thank you for that. Practice and application includes the hands-on materials and manipulatives. I'm looking at the clock, but if you were in my class and I was giving you a lesson on SIOP, I would take some time right now to jigsaw this article. Break you up in groups of 4. One group would be in charge of reading the first 3 paragraphs, etc. The second group, the third group, take some chart paper. Everybody write some key points from the lesson, and then every group present. A different person from the person who wrote would present. And that way, not only have I engaged you in text, which we know our English language learners need in every core area. I don't care if you're the physical education teacher or the chem teacher, the biology or health teacher, they need to be engaged with text, and it shouldn't be the teacher, like I saw unfortunately in a health room, standing there with her teacher's guide as the students pretend to listen as she reads about alcoholism. It has to be with the students themselves interacting and applying text. Taking time to say, after I pose a question about oral language development, to ask you for evidence from the article as to how oral language development helps all students learn. So that article in your packet, or in the handouts that I provided, is from Education Week. Oral Language Skills for English Learners, Focus on Researchers. It cites a lot of examples on how classrooms have to have a focus on discussion. whether you pose a question within a small group, which I call the fishbowl, a small group of perhaps 8 to 10. If you have a large size, it may be larger than that in the middle of the room, and another group of students watching from the outside. Whether you pose a question and ask the students to then carry on the discussion and you take a step back and let that discussion go on, or if you create a debate setting where half the group are the yays and half the group are the nays on whatever issue you're trying to cover, whether it's health or language arts class, you're not only engaging the students with core content, but you're providing them time to develop oral language skills. So we all need that for interviewing. We all need that for any job we're going to get. And our English language learners who just came from Burma, what do you think they're doing when you've placed a few native speakers in that fishbowl exercise? What are they doing in that outlining group? Can you tell me what you think a native speaker from Burma who just arrived would be doing?
Just watching and observing.
Listening and observing and picking up, first on the Bix, but then the kelp. So if I put, like I said, that fishbowl group together in the front of my class or in the middle of the room with 8 to 10 chairs and the rest of the class surrounding them back at their desks or near them, if I put a few native language and maybe my second group of language learners in that group so that they have some time to practice, my newcomers from Burma may be able to do it tomorrow. They may be able to have a similar discussion on a similar topic. I wouldn't give them the same question because they've had a chance to listen in to how the native language have structured their conversation. They'll pick up real quickly on saying words like, I agree because, and because you're well-trained, effective SIOP teachers, you may have those sentence starters right on the board for them. See what I'm getting at? Because I know that there's some high school students that will be able to say, you aren't talking about it right, or you ain't got it right, but they don't always want to use words like, I agree with you, or I do not agree with you because, and then continue that conversation. You see what I'm saying? So we're structuring our classrooms differently, which I know you already know. And for the language learner, they're hearing the sentence structure, they're hearing key phrases, and eventually they're working on their CALPs. You with me? So one thing that I'd like you to continue to work on is making sure no matter what content area you teach that you influence or you use reading, writing, speaking, and listening. What is the output test? Reading, writing, listening, and speaking at their grade level. What do we see on all standardized tests, even if the content is science? A lot of reading, a whole lot of writing. And if they can't read and write on grade level, rarely do you pass the standardized test. Am I right? Okay. Thank you for agreeing with me. I like it when I preach into the choir. Okay. So the last two strategies of SIOP are listed. Lesson delivery. I'm feeling like I'm not engaging 90% of the audience, but that is the idea. And I'll talk a minute here about the content and language objectives. I'll do that now because the review and assessment, I think you can gauge from the PowerPoint. What we do in SIOP, and this is really 90% of SIOP in my mind, is a language and content objective. I should say content objective first. I want you to picture, because I don't have access to a whiteboard in this room, the content being posted. So in an elementary classroom, I write, today we will, and then I write what we're going to do in guided reading. This is an example. We will make predictions after we read pages 5 through 10. We will make predictions, and I'll just leave it as that. For my content, that's what I'm going to do today in guided reading. We will make predictions. The language objective is how we're going to do it. Are we going to listen? Are we going to read? Are we going to write? Are we going to speak? This is the piece where I told you about the English language proficiency standards, having those GLICs for English language learners. That's how those come to play. So if the majority of my kids, the majority of my students are basic, that means the lowest level of the English language learner on the spectrum of language learners, then I'm going to choose a GLIC or a proficiency standard from that set of standards. And those will be a lot of oral communication practice, a lot of sentence starter practice, because I know they're just learning to speak in full sentences. So I will embed one of those proficiency standards, one of those GLICs for English language learners, into my language objective. So I want you to picture teachers using chart paper or not an easel, but the pocket chart. And you would come to me because I was an elementary teacher before. And they're writing down, even for kindergartners, when you talk about clear expectations, they're writing down content. And they have that up there, content. The teachers or the students may not necessarily always know what content is, but they know that's what they're supposed to do. And then the second piece, kindergarten teachers in our buildings every day today are saying, and this is how you're going to do it. So if I say today, boys and girls, we will make predictions from pages 5 through 10. Now I'm going to explain in my next sentence script, or at the top of my board in green, I'm going to tell them how we're going to do it. When I'm going to say, with a partner, you will make a prediction, and both of you will write it down on this sticky note I'm going to hand you. So now I'm giving them a manipulative that they like. They love sticky paper in second grade. I may even eventually assign pages so that predictions come from different pages, but we will have read it from pages 5 through 10. So we will have echo read it, or we will have given them some time to read some of the pages silently. A partner read it. You read one page. The person reads the other page. A lot of that in second grade you have to model and then do. But if I'm in where I am right now in terms of the weeks of the year, the week that we're in, November, I would have already taught how to partner read and how to echo read. So I will have expected that after we've read those pages, that the students in pairs write a prediction about a specific two-page, between 2 pages, what is their prediction of what will happen next. My lower level English language learners may have a sentence starter on the board to help them. Or I'll say, for Miguel, Anna, you can go ahead and use that sentence starter on the board. I predict. The rest of you, you're already really good at this. It doesn't mean that we don't want to help Anna and Miguel, but you may want to start your sentence a little bit differently because you want to get ready for 3rd grade. So the way I even phrased it probably wasn't the best way, but just making sure that you're differentiating. So you may say to the other students, you may not want to start with I predict. You may want to think of another way to say I predict. And so you're challenging them. Well, we've got a couple students here. We're all learning. We all learn differently. My students, if I built my community, know this, are going to start with I predict. And hopefully I've paired them accordingly. Then they would look on each other's paper and say, well, you could start with I predict. Or maybe that native English speaker will say, you could also use I think. Or I wonder if, because prediction is really a wondering, I wonder if the pig, Julius, will learn to be a good friend. Okay? I can also add a challenge for my students that are at the second level of English language learners to explain why they think that. So if they think Julius is going to learn to be a good friend, why do you think that? Whereas on my board, in terms of content and language objective, all I've listed as for how I'm going to do it today is by writing very specifically that they will write with a partner a prediction. See what I'm getting at? So on picture charts, you guys are in classrooms or getting into classrooms, picture on that chart that teachers use, those pocket charts, teachers list what we will do today. In kindergarten, a lot of teachers like to use our job is, and they list to learn about non-living and living things. It's a standard in kindergarten. How are we going to do it? We will categorize pictures. Even if they use that word categorize, you're going to scaffold how they're going to do that. You're probably going to model it in kindergarten. You're going to give them 10 pictures. Then you're going to have to categorize them in a T-chart. Non-living and living. And you'll do that with them for a few examples. Go ahead. That's their expectation for that particular subject matter. So if you're a biology secondary teacher, you may have that same content and language objective for 3 classes. But for an elementary teacher, you really are consistently and concisely planning for blocks of time. So when I train teachers in SIOP, I say just start with one content and language objective in one area, one core area, like language arts, your reading block. We call it in Grand Rapids Public Schools the guided reading block. What are you going to do today is your content. Your language objective is how you're going to do it. But the next layer for the teacher to plan is using the English language learner proficiency standards. Because if I know the largest number of my kids in my class are basics, boy oh boy, I better be planning an objective for them. If I don't write it all the way down, you better know that I'm planning for them. If my largest number of the lowest level is intermediate, which is right in the middle, I'm going to go to those proficiency standards. I'm not going to copy that long glick, but I'm going to embed it into what I want them to do. Because those English language learner proficiencies are written by reading, writing, speaking, and listening. So next time I'm going to remember to bring you that visual, because if you go to the Ken ISD, you can order your own set of English language learner proficiency standards that will guide you K through 12. It's about $3-4, so it's a good investment if you're going to be doing substitute teaching, or if you just want to learn more about this. You'll have a sense of the English language learner proficiency standards. And I mentioned the state of Michigan, you just download that document, PDF file, you will have everything you have ever wanted to know about the ELLS. And if you don't want the ELLS, even just the English language proficiency standards. So moving along here, I do have a DVD. Review and assessment is about what we're going to do at the end of this. For Grand Rapids Public Schools, there's been a grant that required quite a bit of staff development, and that includes principles of learning. So when I do this with Grand Rapids Public School teachers, I mentioned how SIOP has direct connections to academic rigor and accountable talk. Now, the culturally relevant teacher utilizes SIOP. They create and provide structured opportunities for students to engage in English, and there's a lot of emphasis in explicit vocabulary instruction. So I brought one example to share right here. I don't like it, and I don't think it's a best practice to teach words in isolation. If you're a core content teacher, you use words that relate to your text. You may have to go back and use words that are even a little bit lower than your text, but you combine them. You don't just teach, like sometimes I walk into an ESL teacher's class and I say, okay, if you're going to teach fall, it should be connected to a reading. It should be connected to a selection. Even though the theme fall is out there and it's the fall season, connect it to something in a text, or create or find, because the internet has vast amounts of literature, a selection expository text or fiction text on fall, because kids learn when it's connected. This is another example. I'll pass it around in a minute. There's quite a bit of evidence that shows that if you learn root words, this is done in middle school, and you can begin to see the number of words that you can make by knowing a root, your vocabulary will expand. And we're doing this to really teach adolescent children how to have stronger word attack skills. Because when we talk about those standardized tests, if they know what the word miss means, and we teach them conception, there's a bunch of words that they can spell and read and know what they mean just by knowing the word miss, the prefix mix, the root miss. So I want you to become familiar, if you're going to be a culturally relevant teacher, to the procedures for monitoring progress, especially with literacy and language, because they're tied. And I'm going to make mention of one other PowerPoint presentation I'd like you all to put on your desktops or keep. It doesn't let me go back to the, oh, well, if you Google, you can see it right there, www.RTI for success. Can you show me by a bunch of hands, with your hands, how many of you have heard of RTI? Good. So that's response to intervention. When I mentioned earlier that, see, this is PowerPoint 2007, and I'm working on PowerPoint 2003. I got to get with the times. So this particular person, if I can meet her, I'm going to give her a big hug because she's helped me quite a bit. I found her by Googling this site. This company, I don't want to say company, this nonprofit group presented to administrators this summer and actually took lead teachers for Grand Rapids Public Schools. But RTI is a national concept, a national message that's being spread, because what we know in education now is we send many kids to special ed, and they never caught up. The special education teacher, unfortunately, and the building, they were doing two separate things. And we know when we go to the grocery store, there isn't a separate line for our friends in special ed. We have to have the same standards. We just need to scaffold it. We need to differentiate it. So this person took the time. Hopefully she got a PhD out of it because this is how good the PowerPoint is. But she took the time to create an intervention model. We talk about response to intervention, to connect it to English language learners. So this is the model. When you hear RTI, and you want to know this because this is a hot item in education right now, she took the model that's presented that shows what you guys will be doing in your general ed classroom, Tier 1, and she changed it to include the cultural relevant teacher. So you have a read-only file when you go to this site right here, and you'll have the same thing that I have. But I like to use it because I like to give her credit. Even if I took her words and put it in as a citation, I don't think it's as good as this PowerPoint. So she promotes a broader view, which I also believe in, which counts as research and what sorts of empirical evidence are relevant to complex issues that involve culture, language, social interaction, institutions, and cognition. And I only have a couple minutes. So when you read this, she explains what effective teachers do well. And that RTI model that I showed you with the 3 triangles is changed. Notice here that the culturally responsive teacher is in the general ed classroom. It's in Tier 2 where we have a reading coach that works with students. But 80% of your kids are in the first tier. If that second tier, that second layer of support that you do is not working, then they go to the third team. The team that has somebody like you, the future you, will be in a class, in a team talking about the language issues, the language concerns. Okay, so I won't spend any more time on this, but it's definitely a good piece of equipment, or a piece of research that you're going to want to use. And then, if you don't mind, can I show just a little bit of that DVD? Any last questions that you have for me? I can take questions after the DVD, but I don't mind stopping now as well.
In regards to the response to intervention, is Grand Rapids Public Schools already providing these?
What we began this year is a response to intervention model. There's training going on currently for teachers that at all levels. All school district principals and their team had to come up with a model of how they're going to do it in their buildings for the first time this year. The elementary schools came up with a model as what RTI looks like, how support is being offered. Then next year, this year, teachers are just now getting trained in more co-teaching and more specifics. But it's a new thing for Grand Rapids, and I would say it's a new thing for a lot of districts.
Are students also going to have to go through the waiting process and registration process to even get put into the help group?
It's not really a waiting process for Grand Rapids Public Schools. I can talk about them specifically. If I'm the classroom teacher, I have all my kids, and I work on meeting them and their needs in terms of reading and scaffolding text and doing a lot of hands-on learning. But what we don't want to do anymore is what we used to do, and this is what would happen. Johnny Mendez isn't reading at grade level. Fill out all the paperwork, teacher. Take him to child study. Do some observational protocol things. Tell mom and dad that he's not doing a very good job in reading, and this is why, what you've noticed. Then take him to child study. Child study team has a psychologist, etc., special ed people, and they did a discrepancy model. They took what he knew. It's a discrepancy piece. Is anybody learning about special ed? And eventually this child qualified for special education services. However, what we know today is that English language learners take more time to learn the content. And we have to provide specific interventions for a specific amount of time before we decide that he's going to be in special ed. See what I'm saying? Before he's going to get special ed services, we have to try a specific intervention for a certain amount of time and observe it. So it has to be a much more in-depth process than what it was. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What we've been doing in Grand Rapids is doing a lot of interventions, but we've been doing them with everybody. Now we have to begin doing the second tier of interventions with only that 20 and in some buildings 30 or 40% of kids, not all kids. So this is my DVD. It's about SIOP. I think it'll give you a sense of where your students will be when they enter your classrooms, the kinds of things that they say once they've gotten a chance to gain some English skills to be able to say, you know what, I needed support, and this is why. And it's got the research to back it up. Of course, before you got here, we played it. Probably is. Thank you. I'm just going to do the introduction for you. I want this one. Okay. Sometimes I just move my fingers, I think, too fast. It caught up, though.
For me, the hardest part was when they did give directions and specific math, because I know a lot of math, but I didn't understand my teacher. And in U.S. history, for example, she always wanted to read, but I didn't understand too. And she gives direction.
I always go over time.
And what she say? And she got angry because I didn't pay. She thinks I didn't pay attention, but the problem was I didn't understand.
Well, this won't take long. I know.
In one of my classes, one day I was asking a question. She couldn't understand me, and she didn't know what to do, and I just forget it about my question.
Sometimes when you sit in the class and if you want to ask some question and teacher answer you, sometimes you just speak a little bit fast, and sometimes say don't give any explanation. I mean, I understand, but without explanation it's a little bit hard.
I'm 16 years old and I'm from Colombia.
Iqbal, Afghanistan. I'm in 8th grade.
My name is Eric. My grade is 11. I'm from Hong Kong.
My name is Maria. I am in the 2nd grade. I am from Los Angeles.
Hello, I'm Pooja. I'm in 11th grade and I'm from India.
My name is Nahid. I'm from Sudan.
Hello, my name is Anton, and I'm in 9th grade, and I'm from Ukraine.
My name is Jorge. I'm in 7th grade, and I'm from Mexico.
We are, and SIOP.
The ever-growing number of English learners
just another
in our
small
schools
piece, real quick.
calls for a shift in the way teachers approach the learning context. Recently, the number of English learners in U.S. public schools grew 145%, while total enrollment increased only 20%. In 15 states, EL enrollment grew 200%, and 1 in 5 school-aged children is a non-native English speaker. Coupled with the changing demographics is the reality that these students have consistently underperformed in academic settings, a fact that implores every teacher to use research-based practices known to be effective for ELs. Traditionally, much of the instructional responsibility for English learners was left to English as a second language ESL specialists through pull-out services or separate classes. Currently, the number of ELs in many schools necessitates that mainstream teachers also take responsibility for teaching English learners grade-level content while the students are learning a new language. The goal is to enable English learners to meet high academic standards in content classes, such as science, social studies, math, and language arts.
Sheltered instruction is the approach most commonly prescribed for teaching content to students who are learning challenging new material at the same time they are acquiring English as a new language. In sheltered instruction classes, teachers make the grade-level curriculum topics accessible for English learners by using specialized strategies and techniques that accommodate their second language development needs. Sheltered teachers cover the regular core curriculum, but modify their instructional practices in order to promote development of academic English as it's used in particular subject areas.
And I'll stop it there.
In response to the need for effective instruction for English learners,
but I think you get the idea because I covered sheltered instruction and you get a visual sense. So not only did I try to meet your needs as a learning style more visually, but that is something we want to do with our English language learners, is not just lecture. Questions? Comments? I know you guys have to get going too, so if you could quickly, if you remember what I put down in the last slide, if you didn't grab a sticky note copy, what I'm looking for is 3, 2, 1. 3 things you learned, just a quick phrase or a sentence. 2 things you still wonder about, and 1 thing you have a question about, comment about, to give me feedback so that I can better meet needs of a presentation of community college students, future educators of America, and for me to better understand what you learned or what you got out from this. So this is a spot checking exercise, a model that you would use if your classrooms are up to 37, unfortunately, in some of our public high schools, and you would want to have a way at the end of the day, at the end of that hour, to be able to gauge their understanding.
Does the intensity get diluted as they go into high school?
The intensity of SIOP?
Yeah.
I don't believe so, because the content is pretty rigorous. If you look at our high school expectations and our expectations all along. I mean, I look at the expectations of first grade and even kindergarten, and that's what we used to teach for first grade. So the expectations of a high school learner in terms of biology and whatnot are tough. What I found most challenging for that teacher is that they have to teach reading strategies, you know, skills to help them understand the content. And I think that teachers have to spend a lot of time preparing lessons in which they can do hands-on, like experiments, but at the same time build that vocabulary and reading piece. And it's tough.
Yeah, the test that we use here at the GRCC is called the IQ Placer Low.
Okay.
And that's what measures the English level for non-English speakers. The concern is that we get so many high school students that still need
That's right.
the second language, the English language.
Well, I would say that's because what we've done in our schools is we've rushed them through. We've said that, you know, once they hit this high intermediate level, we don't need to provide services. And when I'm going back, and this has been my big challenge this year, is creating more sheltered instruction classes in our high school. But yeah, I think in the past, I can only speak about my district, hasn't done enough to adequately prepare them in structured classrooms, which is why the big push on SIOP. But I could see how even, you know, a student at risk in our high school that graduates hopefully would fall into that category and not doing well on your proficiency test, just because academically speaking and academically rigorous English and communication and writing skills don't always be at the right level. They're not always at the level they should be to enter community college. That's where we need to have rigor, but we need to have specific instruction that will guide their learning. And I talk a lot about text because so much of what we teach is based on text, that a lot of it has to come from reading strategies, content vocabulary, previewing text, teaching the vocabulary throughout the lesson, testing vocabulary along with content. And then doing projects that, if I'm teaching the Revolutionary War, then I'm creating a project that describes the Revolutionary War based on a specific area of emphasis or a theme. And we're trying to train our teachers to get higher and better at that. But that is what I think is the reason why your kids from our Grand Rapids Public Schools would probably not do so well proficiency-wise on that test, is we haven't done enough in terms of a sequence of classes for them where they would get sheltered instruction. But I'm working on it. It's tough with the budget cuts and with everything else going on in the district. To provide support requires manpower and personnel, and we don't get a lot of that right now. We used to be able to fund parapros with monies from the ELL funding, and the state of Michigan has said that you can't do that anymore, and that's unfortunate, but the truth.